With the master cylinder reinstalled, now it's time to bench bleed the master cylinder. Hello and welcome back to the garage. One of the important things that needs to get done when you install a master cylinder is to bench bleed it. What bench bleeding is you're getting the air that's stuck in the master cylinder out of it. Some people like to bench bleed or like to bleed the system by going through the nipples on the brake calipers, but unfortunately some cars are more difficult than others to do, and on a Ferrari 308 you can run liters and liters through the system and never quite get all the air out. So bench bleeding is very important. So how do you do it? Well, here the master cylinder has been reinstalled. Now some people like to bleed master cylinders on a vise. And that's great, but the problem is that on this car, in order to be able to access all the bolts that hold the master cylinder in place, you have to remove the bottle. And by removing the bottle, it makes it difficult to have a properly bled master cylinder. So you're going to be doing it on the car. Doing it on the car is quite simple. It's a little contraption over here where the hoses that come off of the master cylinder, instead of directing themselves into the hoses that go to the wheels, they're not connected, and these are just the hoses that come out and back into the bottle. This contraption is something I came up myself with just a couple of fittings, but if you don't have any of this stuff available to you, a regular auto parts shop will have a brake bleeding kit, and those kits will give you the hoses and everything that you need in order to be able to do this. It's only a few dollars. It's definitely worth it. Another little trick as well is right here we have everything filled up with brake fluid in the master cylinder, and we have put these covers on. If these covers are not on, when we go through the pressing procedure, fluid actually will squirt up and it can make a mess. So we work with only the central hole here. And lastly, when it comes to brake fluid, we're going to be using a high quality, in this case a brand called Pentacin DOT4 brake fluid. And a couple of tricks. Brake fluid absorbs a lot of water, so you want to start with a fresh bottle or a bottle that's not too old. And when you open a bottle, get a Sharpie and write on it the date, so that way you can know how old the fluid is. You really don't want to use fluid that's more than about 6 months old. So DOT4, you can use DOT5, which is silicone fluid, which has a much longer shelf life, only if the system is completely virgin and empty. If it's not, you need to take everything apart and flush it, because if there's any traces of any other fluid, it's totally incompatible with DOT5 fluid. So, getting back to this, I have a helper in the car. My brother Paul is going to help us here. And now we're going to go through the procedure of getting the air out of the system. So Paul, if you can take the brakes through a couple of cycles. There you go. And you'll hear and you'll see bubbles coming through the lines here. And what we're going to do is we're just going to do this over and over and over again. It can be 20, 30 pumps sometimes, until all of the air comes out of the line. So now you can see the bubbles in the fluid. And the fluid moves forwards and backwards, and as you do more and more strokes, you get less and less air. So we're going to go through that procedure and come back as soon as we're done. With the bench bleeding done, now I've put the cover back on, topped up the brake fluid, and it's time to start bleeding the braking system. Just a couple of things. Going back to the hoses, you want to use the flared type box end wrench to tighten them. And of course you want to have a nice paper towel underneath, because as you can see, when you remove the hoses, you get a good leak of brake fluid. And lastly, we want to reconnect the hoses, or the wires, I'm sorry, that go to the floats on the master cylinder. So we redo all of those connections. And the next step is to bleed the braking system. As far as bleeding the braking system goes, there's nothing special about it. Standard procedure, tons and tons of videos on YouTube about it. The only thing is good practice. You always want to start with the caliper that is furthest from the master cylinder and work your way closer. Thanks again for joining me. Hit like and subscribe, and come back for another video in the future.